dream. It is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up, live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. I have a dream. My 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today.
The Corps was founded in 1942 as the Committee of Racial Equality, later changed to Congress of Racial Equality, by an interracial group of students in Chicago: Bernice Fisher, James R. Robinson, James L. Farmer Jr., Joe Gwynn, George Hauser, and Homer Jack. Founders of CORE were deeply influenced by Mahatma Gandhi's teachings of nonviolent resistance. CORE's aim is to bring about equality for all people regardless of race, creed, sex, age, disability, sexual orientation, religion, or ethnic background. In pursuing its aim, CORE seeks to identify and expose acts of discrimination in the public and private sectors of society. CORE was funded entirely by the voluntary contributions of its members. In 1942, CORE began protests against segregation in public accommodations by organizing sit-ins. In 1942, CORE expanded nationally. James Farmer traveled with Bayard Rustin, a field secretary with the Fellowship of Reconciliation, and recruited activists at Fellowship of Reconciliation meetings. Early growth was almost entirely of white middle-class college students from the Midwest. The CORE pioneered the strategy of nonviolent direct action, especially the tactics of sit-ins, jail-ins, and freedom rides. Through sit-ins and picket lines, CORE had success in integrating northern public facilities in the 1940s. To have a national impact, it was necessary to strengthen its national organization. James Farmer became the first national director of CORE in 1953.
With the Montgomery bus boycott, one of history's most dramatic and nonviolent protests. 381 days of standing strong. Study the nation and the world. It was this protest that sparked the beginning of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. The name, so fitting for this organization, drawing strength from the Black church. This mass movement was based on Christian beliefs of love and forgiveness.
The Southern Christian Leadership Conference was formed months after the Montgomery bus boycott, which happened on December 5, 1955, after Rosa Parks was arrested for refusing to give up her seat to a white man. This boycott ended on December 21, 1956, and a few weeks after, on January 10, 1957, the SCLC was founded. The founders were Andrew Young, Rob Abernathy, Martin Luther King Jr., and Ella Baker. The SCLC signaled to the society to fight for equality through the efforts of their president, Martin Luther King Jr., who spoke publicly. He encouraged African Americans to educate themselves against the norms of society to gain civil rights. With an improper education, the African Americans were unable to apply for citizenship. The Crusade for Citizenship urged African Americans to register to vote. The SCLC launched the voting registration campaign in 21 cities throughout the South. From the Voice of King: we must and we will be free. We want freedom now. We want the right to vote now. We don't want freedom fed us in a teaspoon over another 150 years. Under God, we were born free. Misguided men rob us of freedom. and we want it back, and we'll keep it forever.
We stood for a more democratic society. Nonviolent, organized, we stood for the right of people to be progressive justice.
Let the people decide.
The letters SNCC stands for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, commonly called SNCC for its initials.
The SNCC wanted to achieve political and economic equality for blacks through local and regional action groups. In 1960, Greensboro, North Carolina, the former SCLC leader, Ella Baker, helped set up First Meeting. She wanted students in a movement who could not identify with the SCLC to look beyond integration to broader social change and use King's principle of nonviolence as a political tactic, then a way of life. Later, the group started meeting and they formed different social action radicalism. John Lewis helped pave the way when he marched on Washington with Martin Luther King and was later in prison. But many say that he saved the civil rights movement when he spoke out and could identify with the younger generation and also those older than him. Carmichael also used the Black Power movement to motivate others to use their skill set to save the civil rights movement.
Hear me. We are requesting all citizens to move into Washington, to go by plane, by car, bus, any way that you can get there. Walk if necessary. We are pushing for jobs, housing, desegregated schools. This is an urgent request. Please join.
Despite Executive Order 8802 by President Franklin D. Roosevelt, which led to the formation of the Fair Employment Practice Committee, high levels of African American unemployment and overall discrimination in the workplace was still a problem in the United States. This led A. Philip Randolph to begin organizing what would be known as the March on Washington. On behalf of several organizations, including the SCLC, CORE, and the SNCC, Randolph sent a letter to Secretary Stuart Udall of the Department of the Interior regarding permits for a large-scale march, which would end at the Lincoln Memorial. Other groups would support the march and help with preparation, such as the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the National Urban League, the United Auto Workers, and the National Council of the Churches of Christ in America. On August 28, 1963, more than 200,000 people would gather in Washington for this peaceful protest. As evident by the program of events, this was a very diverse group of people. Organized by Bayard Rustin, singers Marian Anderson and Bob Dylan performed. Rabbi Joachim Prinz, president of the American Jewish Congress, gave a speech, and one of the most memorable moments in civil rights history also took place: Martin Luther King's I Had a Dream speech. The March on Washington was very successful and ended with a meeting between John F. Kennedy and many leaders of the movement. Many believe that this was the foundation for success for civil rights.
In 1961, CORE began a new tactic aimed at desegregating public transportation throughout the South. These tactics became known as the Freedom Rides. The Freedom Rides took place on May 4, 1961, when 7 blacks and 6 whites left Washington, D.C. on 2 public buses bound for the Deep South. They intended to test the Supreme Court's ruling in Boynton versus Virginia, which declared segregation in interstate bus and rail stations unconstitutional.
The SCLC got media attention when they were attacked in boycotts. The Freedom Riders were attacked by bombs and beaten in Grey Hood buses May 14, 1961, Anniston, Alabama, because the Ku Klux Klan didn't like them. The SCNC took over the Freedom Rides. After the boycotts, John Lewis and Jim Sirk took leadership. Leaders and others were attacked, gaining television coverage, and some were put in.
The students Ezell A. Blair Jr., Lincoln E. McCain, Joseph A. McNeil, and David L. Richmond sat down at the Woolworth counter asking for service, but got denied. When asked to leave, they used passive resistance. The students' civil rights organizations such as the SNCC, churches, and community joint protests lasted 6 months, and this led to the desegregation of the FW Woolworth lunch counter. Community joined forces outside to protest, and later it became known that the whites and blacks could sit next to each other on the lunch counter after all. This ended July 25, 1960.
Even though the Civil Rights Bill was passed, voters' rights for African Americans was still an issue. On March 5, 1965, Martin Luther King went to Washington to speak to President Johnson about a voting rights bill and, during that day, announced a plan to march from Selma to Montgomery as a protest to voting discrimination. On March 7, 1965, 600 people attempted the march but were beaten back physically with billy clubs and tear gas on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. National coverage of the event, known as Bloody Sunday, raised awareness, and on the second try, more than 2,000 people attempted the march. They reached Edmund Pettus Bridge, but, led by King, dispersed as it was evident that violence would break out. This was known as Turnaround Tuesday. On March 20th, 1965, President Johnson would pass an executive order ordering the Alabama National Guard, Army, and military troops to protect the protesters. On March 25th, 1965, 8,000 people would successfully complete the march. And on August 6, 1965, persistence would pay off as Johnson would pass the Voting Rights Act.
One day, when the glory comes, it will be ours, it will be ours. Oh, one day, when the war is won, we will be sure